All right. This is a fill-in talk. The original talk, they didn't stick. The recording didn't last, so this is a fill-in. It's difficult because my consciousness is different from when the original talk was given, and I do things in a little bit different way. And the original talk was given about 11 years before this fill-in recording. So, unfortunately, the notes are very good, so we should do all right. This is for the Isadora Duncan personality study, talking about the whole person, especially the whole external person, especially the physical body. And dancers rely on the whole body more than every other kind of artist. Painters and sculptors use tools. Musicians use instruments. Actors and actresses use their whole body, but not vigorously. They specialize mostly in voice and in gestures. So this horoscope of a dancer gives us the opportunity to look at the body and the personality in this light as an artistic instrument, the instrument of the spirit using its personality to express in art. Now, often people do not have parity in the use of the body in relation to the external world. Some people give out more through the body than they take in, and with others it is the reverse. Without observation or intuition, when observation is not available, it is impossible to tell which kind of person is which. Usually the negative signs tend to take in more than they give out, and the positive signs, when they're rising, tend to give out more than they take in. But that's not a guaranteed or a given. It's a rough thing that you can use when you're looking at the physical body and the personality. This horoscope is not a disappointment in this regard. She did observe in the external world, or she could not have been as interpretive of the world as she was without being observant of what takes place in the external world. That said, she was primarily a giver. Dance, the way she conceived of it, was not just pretty movements set to music, which it is in many dance forms. She tried to express and convey inward impressions and ideas in dance by expressing through her whole body. Now, this is not a simple task, especially if some of the things you're trying to express are abstract. She did think that some postures and positionings were classical and had a classical ideal for that, and that they related classically to the body. But she did much more than that with her body and with dance. What we are speaking of is a philosophy of beauty, what an artist considers beautiful. And the philosophy of beauty that an artist has is called an aesthetic. In general, aesthetics are ruled by Venus. Venus is the lady of aesthetics. Now, in some languages, the word used for beauty is the same as the word for shine. German is the classic example. Rudolf Steiner tells us that schön, which is beautiful, comes from schön or shine, the same root, that something from within shines out, and that's what causes something to be seen as beautiful. In fact, usually it is the life spirit that shines through. In the Latin languages, beauty is associated with the word for good, as a quality of the spirit. So the idea that what is beautiful is in that same act or in that same state is good. So what is good is the love that shines through, and that is a unifying thing. As we know, Venus is the planet that draws things together and tries to bring them into a unity with each other. So the whole idea of an aesthetic follows along those lines. Now, Plotinus, the great Neoplatonistic philosopher, thought that the most beautiful thing in the world that we see with our eyes was fire. Because fire was most like the spirit, and it brought through the nature of spirit into the physical world better than anything else. Very different idea of an aesthetic. To dance as Isadora conceived dancing, what it was meant to be, one must bring the spirit of the music and beyond the music into the spirit itself, outward into the world. Now we realize we can do that with words and with the voice, but with the whole body it's another matter. We have examples of it. If we look in the heavens, we see that the stars are the outer bodies of divine beings, and their inner spirituality radiates out in their stellar emanations. Of course, what is emanated is simple, and that the spirit that it emanates from is abstract, but still it is the best example that we have in the physical world of something inward being directly expressed through the outer nature. Now what we see around us is complex and concrete, as we see that when we work with photography. It's very complex and very concrete. In order to have an aesthetic that emulates the simple to the complex and the abstract to the concrete, one must believe that one can emulate the activity and emanate things from within through the body and condense them into forms that are representative of what the spirit intends. Basically, that's what she tried to do. Now, gesture and a convention like sign language are part of it, but it can't be all of it, or it would be something like pantomime or something very simplistic. The energy of the spirit itself must be emanated. This means some kind of direct emanation of energy conveyed to the observer. Something like what we say in slang when we say he has a good energy about him. What we have just tried to do is to verbalize some of the aesthetic of Isadora Duncan. What we have just tried to do is to verbalize how this aesthetic was represented by Venus conjoined the ascendant as she expressed her aesthetic. Every art and every aesthetic has its problems to solve to be optimal. Hers was the problem of how to convey emanate or express energy as purely as possible, avoiding excessive gesture. Moreover, there was the problem of conveying beauty through energy without having the energy dominate the beauty, which would be something like gymnastics. They're beautiful, but they don't convey the very subtle things that she was trying to convey. These problems are symbolized by Venus conjoined the ascendant in Aries. And Aries is the detriment of Venus. When Venus is in detriment, there's always a problem of love and beauty being carried away into excessive energy in Aries, or the other detriment into excessive desire in Scorpio. One can do wonderful things with such astrological paints as can be seen from her work. But there is always a swimming upstream or going against the current than trying to do something impossible when you're working with a detriment. Love and beauty lose something to the character of energy or desire, to assertiveness of energy that takes away from the attractiveness of love and beauty. But it has to be expressed even in sacrifice, and she did it with the ardency that you find when you have Venus in Aries. She was, from early on, an aesthete, as the world would expect, with Venus conjoined the ascendant from the first house. She loved nature, but not in such a way that she would receptively immerse herself in it. Some people do that for hours. But that was not what she was like, and that's not like her horoscope. She liked many moving, changing impressions in nature as they moved across her field of being impressed, which is like her horoscope. But she just would not be impressed alone. There had to be immediate action taken with regard to the input that she was doing. This is what the Aries does. This is the extroversive side of it. It has to be expressed, even in sacrifice. And she did that with all the ardency of Venus in Aries. From early on, first house represents the early part of life. She was an aesthete, as you would expect, with Venus in the first house. Her mother immersed her in music, classical music, from infancy on. However, despite this immersion, you wouldn't consider her a culture maven. She loved more vigorously, and she loved with an inspiring energy that flowed through her. So she wasn't just someone that was the darling of going to art shows and things like that. She loved art, and she loved the cultural scene, but she was much more interested in new things. Not necessarily fads. Aries can sometimes represent fads and faddism. And the fresh inspirations. These new things are what moved her, even though she had a sort of a classical notion of things. These are all characteristics of Venus in Aries in the first house conjoined the ascendant. There is something a little shallow in this, but that is the nature of Venus in Aries. To some extent, the nature of dynamic art must suffer some shallowness, because there isn't time to linger and bring through deeper and more pondersome things. Venus does have another aspect beside the conjunction. It is in a weak trine to Uranus in Leo and the 5th house. This shows that her dance was more than a practicing or presentation of artistic motions to convey an impression. It has something much more abstract than that, something much more idealistic, something of a kind of a almost spiritual romanticism to it. So there was an element of spontaneous creation in the act of performance. And the performance was important for that reason, because it was live and the Uranian spontaneity could be brought to the art. However, because this aspect is pretty weak and the other contributors to the personality are strong, each performance was not really a radical departure from all of his predecessors. Inspiration and creation, like much of the aesthetic, is swept away by energy. This again is necessary in the same way that actors must almost shout in order to get the words across to a large audience if it's a stage play. And that takes away from nuance in voice. And similarly, to bring things out in dance, the vigor that is required takes away a lot of the nuance in bodily motion. Now, since that stream of energy is overwhelmingly important, let's look at it. Normally, when one thinks of Aries, one thinks of flame. When strong and directed outward, one gets the image of a blowtorch or a welding torch or something like that, an intense outflowing of flame. Now, these images don't work in this case completely, because Mars, the ruler of Aries and the ascendant, is in a water sign. Even using a jet of hot water doesn't work, because Mars is in a very strong square with the moon, which is also strong. When Venus is taken into account, all of the emotionality significators are involved in the personality. Thus, like in the Gandhi chart, to know the personality is to know the emotionality, and to know the emotionality is to know the personality. However, unlike the Gandhi personality, this is not a personality of power, but a personality of energy, emotional energy. The Venusian aesthetic is always a matter of feeling and emotion. Higher, loving feeling and emotion. Thus, what we are seeing is loving emotion lost to lower desires. Not necessarily base emotions, but certainly not all lofty emotion. At this point, we have several conflicting and almost contradictory elements and images hanging on the personality, and they need clarification and synthesis. Let's look at the components first and then synthesize, if there's time. Aries rising has something to do and somewhere to go. It is driven. It is not a discriminating sign, just as energy is not discriminating. Energy doesn't care what it does or where it goes, as long as it does both. Venus is tasteful, and love needs an object which it wants to love forever, so one can see an internal conflict which affects both, as we have seen in her aesthetic. The effect is not beloved. It's something like seeing a beautiful plumed macaw riding on the back of a charging ram. That's a pretty good image of what this personality is, as so far as we've seen it yet. The hitch in this is Aries rising and its ruler. Every sign affects the ruler, and the ruler affects every sign. Mars is in Pisces, its fall. In its exaltation, Capricorn, the discipline and goal-oriented perspective of Saturn and Capricorn, give Mars objectivity, and they control it and direct it, and the energy always works towards some definite end. It isn't just a splash of energy wherever interest takes it. Cancer is a more internal and subjective sign, so it is more something like the subconscious in the fourth house. It's very, very subjective. What we see when we look from the home point of view. It's a clannish kind of, this is the way our people do it thing. Water, internalizing water, turns energy and emotion on itself, and it boils and it churns in an internalizing, gyrating circulation. This is what it's like to have Mars in its fall in Cancer. Obviously, she draws on subconscious drives within herself to externalize her feeling. Her whole life is filled with incidents of that. In short, she gets excited, and that excitement carries outward into the external world. It is sweetened and it is flavored by her love and her aesthetic, but the emotional excitement is just that, emotional excitement. In fact, she generated more excitement in her performances than she did sublime aesthetic experience. You didn't go and be awed by the beauty that she expressed. Usually that was the case. She appealed to younger people. Students loved her because there was that excitement, that enthusiasm about it. And she would give a performance, and the young students would carry her off on their shoulders. This is quite an interesting. She generated more excitement in her performances than the sublime the sublime aesthetic experience that they could have been. It is subjective, but because of the Venusian aesthetic and the archetypical character of the body and the world, it is not lost in subjectivity, but it has a share of objectivity because of the nature of the body. Though she had a large and enthusiastic following, her work was not a subjective cult, and it was not carried exclusively by her personal charisma, though that certainly was a part of it. Now, despite the fervor and the wide, enthusiastic disposition of her work, it took a while for there to be a Duncan dance movement where other people would follow after her. Now this pattern, as we have followed it so far, describes her methods of development. She always had a home studio, as one might expect with Mars in the fourth house, in which she would work on drawing external impressions as they appeared in her person. She would understand them as they impacted her subconscious. She would not know exactly where she was going, when she began things, but as she got excited and worked more and more, things would come out of her, or things would come clear to her, and this is the way that she developed her different dance motions. However, though these things give some idea of her modus operandi, they are insufficient to describe her work completely. To get closer at that, we must look at something redundantly similar, but magnitudes much more influential. That is the Moon-Mars square, which is the strongest aspect in the chart. This is almost like Mars in Cancer being redoubled or cubed or something like that. So let's do an analysis of it. We have the Moon, which is the number 3 planet. And we have the square, which is the strongest square in the horoscope. And we have Mars, which is the strongest planet in the horoscope. Since there are 10 planets, if everything were equal with all of them, one would expect that each planet would have 10% of the planetary activity. Mars has 22% of planetary activity, which means it's more than twice what one would expect if all planets were on a par. The Moon has 12% of all planetary activity, which is still more than the average. So, the Moon represents feeling, imagination, pictorial imagination, nurture, the mother, and intimacy. Mars represents drive or desire. It represents direction. It represents construction. It represents masculinity. And it represents competitiveness. Now, putting together some of the keywords from these two planets, we can get something of an idea or a few ideas of what's involved. It's a conflict between smothering, watery feeling and, along with that, incubatory maternalism, and that is struggling with driving and directing fiery, constructive projection. So it's a combination of simple masculinity and simple maternal femininity. Both planets are simple. They're called primitives on the ladder of the planets. Being primitive, they're in touch with the things of nature, like sensing arrival or natural protectiveness or procreation of the species, those sorts of things. In short, the two have in common natural instinct. Now, the Moon and Saturn would indicate instinctual fears or cautions. On the other hand, the Moon and Mars, which is our case, indicate instinctual desires, drives like breeding or trying to. Mars-Moon people dislike inhibition of natural drives, and they cannot be convinced otherwise because their criterion is instinct, and the instinct is feeling, and the feeling is intense, and rationality doesn't penetrate into that evaluation of feeling. The common retreative house positions, the 12th and the 4th, accentuate this unconscious element. It's like saying, this is so natural, it must be done. In the afflictions, there is emotional combativeness. It is a survival of the fittest. In either combat or in copulation. There's an element of combat in the copulation that even the gentle Venus could not completely overcome. Not necessarily rough sex, but definitely at least emotional conflict. This is something that happens quite often. I like to refer to it as the F&F syndrome. That is the fornicating or fighting syndrome. That there is, Scorpio is a very repulsive sign, and to enter into sexuality just in terms of sexuality itself and not with sufficient love has that problem to it. I can remember at one time living in an apartment with a very thin ceiling, and my bedroom was exactly below the bedroom of a couple that had the F&F syndrome. And literally it was a matter of, "Oh, Sam, you're killing me." Or when it came to the fighting part of it, "Oh, Sam, you're killing me." It was that kind of a relationship. In the square, they are indeed squared off against each other. And there's something fixed about that in an almost eternal emotional conflict. It's something like having a tug of war where instead of the two teams pulling at each other, they're pulling around the trunk of a tree. And so they're at 90 degrees from each other rather than 180 degrees. And that makes it much more difficult for one side to pull or overcome the other. Even if one team is much stronger, the 90-degree rub is sort of an equalizer. If the moon is stronger, if the moon is stronger, it is like meeting a wave of hot water. Not boiling, but hot, and struggling with it. It's a vigorous battle that is exhausting. One can't help to hold up any of the Mars-Moon afflictions as long as they are strong. One either melts or withers away. When the moon is strong, it is extremely exciting, and the excitement is tiring. When the moon and Mars are of equal strength, the battle is pitched because there is no outright winner. And nothing that forces one into the camp of the other. Still, there is exhaustion from it. One does not know whether it is an offensive or a defensive struggle, the moon being defensive and Mars being offensive. One does not know whether it comes from pushing or whether it comes from drawing the other out. It is a beleaguered, balanced excitement. If Mars is the stronger planet, which is our case, the intensity is the predominating factor. It's like a scalding or a steam jet. It's not and cannot be overwhelming. That's the nature of desire. Mars asserts itself harder and harder. The moon retreats to a point until it reaches the limit of compression, and then it seems to push back in that defensive way. Like all things of desire, it seems perpetual. Like the old misnotion of life, the more energy one spends, the more energy one can draw in. And usually people who are proponents of that exhaust themselves in life very quickly. It just isn't true. This Isadora lived that way. She felt as long as she was expressing energy that there would be more available to her. It lasted for some years, but it didn't last long. Now, despite the constancy of the square, and despite the limit of compression, both planets wish to emote. Both planets want fluency, and they will not be denied. When one or both planets gets its way, it's spent swiftly and one is soon exhausted. Even if there is a non-active or non-decisive stalemate, the pressure itself is exhausting. So this is true in short term and in long term. And it is especially so when Mars is involved. It will spend itself to exhaustion. So we're talking about an aspect that is filled with energy and excitement, but also that is draining and exhausting. We're talking about what is the strongest aspect in the horoscope. It indicates the first choice in terms of tools. It's the tool that's going to be used most often in life, and one will always go to it. It's the first choice. It's something like a fierce, strong warrior with an excellent weapon with which it is accustomed. And it goes to that weapon again and again. The square is a material aspect or a materializing aspect. Everything is built by the square. So Mars is right at home with it. Mars is a builder, and especially if the energy is channeled. In some ways, though, Mars is not at home with it in this case, because Mars is in its fall in Cancer, and in abstract fall in being in the 4th house. So fiery Mars does not like active water. It's like washing over it again. And deliberate action does not like the subconscious indirection. Mars likes a keen blade, and it likes to cut through water with no resistance, but the water then reforms on the other side of the stroke. Nothing is accomplished. With no resistance, it can cut and cut again furiously until it tires itself out. Nothing changes with the tiring. This is the nature of the fall of Mars. It sounds ironic, but the keenness of Mars is blunted by the non-resistance of active water. All of the Mars-Moon aspects have a bluntness about them, especially if water is involved. There is one way in which Mars is both at home and not at home in this aspect. This is another case of a mutual reception aspect. Mars is in the Moon's sign Cancer, and the Moon is in Mars's sign Aries. We have said before, and this is a very good example again, that mutual reception, when two planets are in mutual reception, the planets have some sort of a track about them that they can't derail themselves from that track, and they become syndromic. They repeat the same thing over again and again, and you just can't detract them. In this case, the track is a battle. Mars is an offensive battler, the Moon is a defensive battler, and the square is a battling aspect. When the combatants have been battling for a long time, the 4th and 12th house positions indicate that these are things that have been utilized so much that they are part of the superphysical nature, and they're almost destined. They've interacted with each other so strongly, the two different types of emotions in this, that each knows the other's maneuvers. And they can counter and recounter and do this over again and again, and that's again what the mutual reception is like. Eventually, each one learns the tactics of the other and applies the tactics against the other. So they're like stuck in a tape loop, and they stay in it until the energy runs out, but when the energy is renewed again the next day, it's the same thing all over again. This is very different from where each planet sticks to its own activity and causes conflict by coming from its strength with the other, rather than being in the hands of the other and reflecting the other. Okay, let's try to look at one manifestation of the syndrome, but there are many. Something in the outer world, probably an action in nature, or even a deed of some kind or another, activates Mars through the ascendant. In the fourth house, which is where Mars is, it becomes immediately, it strikes something in the subconscious nature. An active impression is set up immediately. The active impression churns into subconsciousness without resistance, and it's something like a subconscious boiling anger. And it seems to go over again and again and again. By indirect action, this activates Aries. So it comes back, because by indirect action we mean that Mars rules the ascendant, and so that activates everything in Aries. This works out something like if you have a hot skillet and you put a drop of water in it, the surface tension of the water keeps it from adhering and keeps it from immediate evaporation. I'm sure you've seen this. It's like a little ball of water bounces around, getting nowhere, but it just bounces all over the skillet. The bouncing ball is a hot seat. And in this case, it's the moon, which is activated and activates Mars. The moon activates Cancer, and Cancer becomes so turbulent, hot, and exciting to Mars, and because of Mars. So this is, like one thing is activating the other, and it activates back in turn. This Mars is like a vigorous swimmer treading water, and the water itself is vigorously turbulent. This is by the indirect action, and so the syndrome goes around and around. Now the above is the only the indirect part of the syndrome, the part that works through mutual reception rulerships. There is the direct part from planet to planet through the aspect. Let's begin the same way through the ascendant, activating Mars from an impulse in the outer world. Mars is stimulated and gets excited. The stimulation especially excitement and stimulation are especially good keywords for Mars in the ascendant. Mars responds emotionally. Emotion is another good keyword for the whole pattern. Mars wishes to register the stimulus or make it work. It wishes to do this by impressing itself into the feelability, which is indicated by the moon, to initiate and sustain some kind of action or some kind of response. Because there's no traction, this is something like trying to toss hot boiling water from a boat. The boat retreats. A hot bowling ball. I got on. So it's like trying to throw a hot bowling ball from the back of a boat. Because there's no traction, the energy and the action of throwing the ball causes the boat to go the other way. The boat retreats, and the ball doesn't get very far. It stays close, and it splashes back, and you have scalding water coming back on you. The moon, on the other hand, tries to take the missile and smother it and cool it. It is already in a place that is too hot. We said that this was in hot water for the cooling of the ball, so it isn't the lunar part is not very successful. It tries to cool the ball and ends up becoming overheating and spewing hot water back to Mars. So it's an image, something like that is what we're looking at. It reciprocates by throwing a new energy missile back and to receive more of a blast of hot water back. This is the way syndromes go, and when the mutual reception is an aspect that is a malefic, it is that kind of a thing. It's sort of like fighting for fighting's sake. Now, if you can imagine both the direct and indirect components, you have a pretty good feel of what this pattern is like. Though there is a blur of action and reaction, it's pretty stable. And in its stability, she develops her routines out of her imagination and her subconscious images. This is how she created many or most of her dance movement, in a flurry of feeling and motion, feeling and working things out. Because of the mutual reception, there was something of a revolution, a rotation, or a spinning of the emotion and energy. Her emotional externalization and the excitement from them were part of a very steamy field. But we do spin-offs and ejaculations and spinning things off into the world. So she took this pattern and used it in that way. Now, none of this sounds very pretty. It doesn't sound like art. In fact, it all sounds a bit primal or primitive, and that's because it is. It was not more baseness, or if it had been, it would have been considered vulgar. But it was part of her inner atmosphere that she was able to externalize. As a matter of fact, some audiences, especially those in the United States, did consider it vulgar. Sometimes a retreat to reincorporate something primal is left behind with too much refinement, and then it becomes effete. And that's certainly not the case with her. This is what she did for dance. She opened the door to what would be called modern dance because she got away from a stilted ballet movement and went back to something more primal. That was even part of her conscious mission. So she wouldn't have called it primitive, even though it was obviously so in some ways. Moreover, everything that went out had to pass through Venus conjoined the Ascendant. In so doing, it was somewhat refined by her aesthetic, which we discussed earlier. Thus, if one synthesizes these two things together by holding as many of the images or other impressions that we've developed, you can get a gist of what the pattern is like. In some ways, it was like trying to dress a hot, wet, running sheep with fancy, beautiful clothes. In some ways, it was like trying to shape and perfume a jet of steam. In all ways, it was taking intense, turbulent excitement and doing the best that she could to refine it with something that was not equal in strength to the turbulence and excitement. There's much more that could be said, but it will have to be done by the listener because we have insufficient time to really go into many more things. But before passing into the next component of the personality, there is a part of this pattern that is worth another little peek. The 12th house represents rightness from the past. There are 2 planets there. Both are in Aries and close enough to the ascendant to affect the personality. Saturn indicates something undeniable that could not be worked out any other way except by experience. Direct experience because it's cardinal. The moon is much stronger than Saturn. It's influential and it's closer to the ascendant. The way this worked out in her life shows another side of this pattern that we've been looking at. Now Greece, ancient Greece, had its heyday right in the heart of the age of Aries by the precession of the equinox. Greek philosophy was bold. Greek politics was bold. Greek architecture was bold. It was bold in the Aryan Age time. In the arts, drama was bold. People would become excited so that there were almost uprisings at dramatic plays. The dramas had a chorus to them. In fact, the trying to reenact the dramas with a chorus is where opera developed. And in Isidora's time, she seems to have had an unfulfilled destiny from Greek times. Greece held a great fascination for her. She was not stupid, and she was not unread, but she certainly wasn't a scholar either. Her notions about Greece were what one might expect from a schoolgirl from Oakland. With her Venus in Aries trying to Uranus, she romanticized her notions about Greece. Being as desirable as she was not practical. She traveled to Greece. She bought land in Greece to build her dream house. However, it was a stony, barren hillside, and there was no water, and it was quite a distance away from any source of water, which is sort of something like one would expect with the moon in Aries. She even set her family to work on building the dream house, but then World War I came up and everything was interrupted, and it gave her a good excuse to get out. She was no fool to see that she wasn't doing something very bright. But at any rate, she was taken with the Dionysian ideal of drama, especially in the arts, that everything had to be very dramatic. So what she did when she came back to Europe from Greece is she brought back a boys' choir, and they toured Europe with their dancing and song. They were impressive and they were successful. But eventually the voices started changing and things became a little bit ragged. And the whole business with Greece and the Aries, the positioning in Aries and the mutual reception square seems to be encapsulated right in that. especially trying to keep young boys as boys rather than admitting that they were going to mature and their voices were going to change. Now, it should be noticed that she did not continue her vigorous and active work of dance development past her younger years. She couldn't do that. So again, we must correct through synthesis. First, we looked at the ascetic through Venus in Aries conjoined the ascendant, and we looked at the more dominant part of the personality suffused with intense and strongly sustained desire, emotion, excitement, and stimulation. Now let's incorporate another significant component. One can start a movement and become world famous on the basis of an aesthetic, but it doesn't happen often. In this chart, Venus seems too weak and out of place to do it. One can become a celebrity by exciting, stimulating, and intense emotions. It happens to athletes and to entertainers, but not very often to artists. In this horoscope, there is intense desire, but much of it is hidden in retreat or problem-solving houses, and it is in an affliction which has little time for reaching success. There are no rules or standards in astrology that determine success, but intuition and the facts of history are the only ways that we can come to that. Now, we know she had a sense of beauty, and we know she had extraordinary desire. What more is there that allowed her to become the success that she was? If we look at the horoscope carefully, we see there are 12 degrees of Aries in the first house, and Venus is in the first house, conjoined to the ascendant. There are almost 24 degrees, about double, of Taurus in the first house, and Neptune and Mercury are also in the first house. Both Neptune and Mercury are significantly stronger than Venus. Neptune is at about 8% of planetary activity, Mercury at about 11%, and Venus has only 4%. Now, usually the sign holding the front cusp of a house has an advantage. Also, the earlier planets in a house, especially if in the first sign of the house, have an advantage. These conditions notwithstanding, as the usual cases, Neptune, Mercury, and Taurus certainly have a legitimate claim to being at least as strong and probably stronger than the influence of Venus in the first house. If the first house was exclusively Aries, she would be a bundle of energy, athleticism, and dynamic desire. With this much Taurus, there's something more solid, something statuesque about the personality, something substantial that has some staying ability. With Venus in Aries conjoined the ascendant, she has an aesthetic, but alone it is like directing a hot rod car. And we know that she was much more of an artist than that. With the Neptune and Mercury in the first, with their comparative strength, there is artistic sensitivity and a capacity to communicate it through Mercury. She is less renowned for her sensitivity, which was somewhat muted in Taurus, than for the wild, exciting ways, but the sensitivity was definitely a factor in her life. That is, it is what allowed the impressions to come into her. She even had a few psychic propensities, but not enough to diminish the stabilizing or the steadying or materializing qualities of Taurus. Now, Mercury is the number 4 planet, and at 11%, it is stronger than the average planet. This does not mean that she was brilliant. She was smart enough, but certainly not an intellect. Mercury in Taurus is the kind of mind that the world doesn't recognize as being intelligent. It can be slow, and IQ tests judge things by speed much more than they do of whether one eventually comes up with the right answer or not. So it can be seen as kind of a slow, heavy kind of mind. In this case, it seemed to have been not so much in the mind, but it seems to have been much more neural and not so much mental. Meaning to say that in a way she sort of thinks with her body, and she knows how to make it move one way or another. The strong sextile with Mercury to the first, and Mars ruling descendant indicates an excellent neuromuscular talent. So the Mars-Mercury is like that. Now, one would like to say that she was deft, but there was just a little too much Taurus for that. It's much more like a high performance machine of some kind, rather than a deft or quick turn on a dime kind of quality. The sign position of Mercury and Mars indicates something of a smoothness about this, which means that it wasn't just purely pumping excitement activity. There was a smoothness and a regularity about it. And this fills out the personality, and if you look at videos of her dance, it agrees with the photos and descriptions of her. In synthesis, she is vigorous and strong, but not completely like an athlete. She is beautiful and has some taste, but she's not like a coquette or an aesthete. She is desireful and exciting, but she's not like a prostitute. She is somewhat statuesque, but she's not massive or cumbersome. She has excellent, smooth, neuromuscular abilities and coordination, but not like a prestidigitator with sleight of hand. So she's bright and mentally capable, but not really witty, and she's not really an intellect. And she is sensitive, but not so much so that it overwhelms her. Now that's a pretty good picture of what her outward personality is like. Now let's look a little bit at the sensitivity for a minute. With Neptune in Taurus, this seems to be artistic sensitivity rather than pure spiritual sensitivity. And she didn't display any pure spiritual sensitivity in her life anyway, even though she had a few psychic experiences. Neptune can indicate idealism, tending to spirituality, and she certainly did express a lot of idealism, though it wasn't always of the spiritual nature. But the concerns of the world and the physical appearances and things like that were distracting to it. So it's far more likely that Neptune's position applied more to her aesthetic than to her spiritual sensitivity. It was an extension of her aesthetic into other realms, and it gave it just a little bit more dimensionality. The Mercury-Neptune aspect is a middling aspect. And that aspect is a tune-in aspect. It's seemingly knowledgeable, but more from sensitivity than from true knowledge or from mentation or something like that. The spirit can use the mind as a vehicle for its ends rather than having the mind trying to do it all on its own. It is a knowing, but it is not a proving kind of knowing. It's a knowing that one receives through sensitivity, the knowing of something, and acts on it immediately. She kens in spirit what is beautiful and inspiring and how she can put it into motion. Neptune enters into the execution as well, and it does so through the aspects to Mars and Mercury. She did a lot of practice, and she worked hard at developing movements, as we've noted before. We said that the movements became second nature to her because of the repetition in her excitement when she was working in the studio. And eventually she was able to smooth them out, and they became more aesthetic and they became more graceful. Now, apparently, though, through such work, undoubtedly in the past, too, as indicated by the fixed Taurus, she has gotten in touch with something more in her inner nature. Her movements were neuromuscular, but just a little more than that. The presence of Neptune in the pattern with Mercury and Mars indicates something like an intuitive stamp of spirit, really doing something for the movement itself. The neuromuscular part is merely following the higher influence and the higher intention. Neptune in this pattern adds another dimension to communication and the energy excitement. It shows that some of her energy is raised to a level of charisma, so that there is charisma here that is not just animal magnetism or attraction due to her pouring out her passions. To some extent, her communication and her aesthetic had a mildly mesmeric attraction that one experiences when you see something that has a rare beauty to it. The libertine indulgence of the Mars and the Moon eroded this and eventually overcame it. It couldn't bring things so far as to become vulgar, but she was not without vulgarity. At this point, we ran out of time in composing the notes, and so the final synthesis of bringing all of these elements together, the Taurus element and the Mercury-Neptune element, along with the Mars-Moon, Aries-Cancer qualities, were not completely synthesized, but that's a nice work for the student to undertake. I hope this is helpful to you.